large-scale peer assessment has been a key innovation that MOOCs have brought to the e-learning area. And it's important to understand if peer assessment actually works, if we want to make sure that MOOCs as a medium of professional development works. And I think this is also an important factor to take into account when we talk about the recognition of the learning of the participants, because we need some form of effective assessment in MOOCs to be able to say with confidence, well, I'm going to give you a certificate that recognizes that you have participated and learned on this course. And that's why peer assessment is a fundamental mechanism. So if we want to unlock the potential here of online teacher professional development, especially scalable forms of online teacher professional development, then we don't just need to look at the how we can support teachers. So that's the tutoring model, how we can support them in a more personalized way than is sometimes possible in such scalable online environments, but also how the assessment works. Now, the assessment by an expert, which is sort of the gold standard, even though there are problems with that, isn't really realistic in a MOOC environment, unless you dedicate a lot of resource to that. And that's why peer assessment is, of course, so crucial. So the question that we raised in this investigation is peer assessment as accurate as instructor assessment in teacher training MOOCs? A big proviso here, though, is that actually instructor assessment, we know that from research, is not very accurate and is not necessarily very reliable. If you give 5 different instructors a piece of work to assess, you'll quite likely get 5 quite different answers, different scores from that. And research confirms that. So that is a proviso we need to keep in the back of our head here. Nevertheless, it is, of course, important to still address this because it's mainly about the perception of, is this a valid form of assessment or not? And I think, you know, it comes back to the point I raised at the beginning about formative assessment. If our students are reluctant to do peer assessment because they feel like, well, what's he going to tell me about my score? I mean, he doesn't know about this. Then, well, the value of that is a lot less if there's a reluctance to do that. So we need to make sure also that the perceptions of teachers engaging in this process is positive. Yeah, so before I talk a bit more about this, a quick overview of how peer assessment worked in the TeachUP courses. So in all of the courses, teachers at the end wrote a lesson plan, so addressing collaborative learning or personalized learning or one of the topics of the courses. And then they gave feedback on the lesson plans of 3 peers by giving a score from 1 to 4 in 8 different categories. So addressing assessment, addressing diversity of activities. I'll show them to you in a moment. And in order to present that in a fairly visual way, they identified the scores in this kind of spider net or bullseye diagram. Oh, and very important, of course, they were also asked to give a short qualitative feedback. So write a short text where they explain and justify the scores that they have given. Now, it's important also for context to understand and to know that the peer assessment we organize on our MOOCs, and I think this is the case in many teacher training contexts, it's not just about the assessment of the learning. It's not just a validation of the work that has been done. Of course, that's an important part, and especially regarding the recognition and certification aspect, that's a really important element. So can we, with certainty, say that this person has done the work to the quality required? So that's the peer assessment of learning. But apart from that, there are 2 other very important elements to consider and reasons why we do a peer assessment in our courses. One is that actually the process of participating and engaging in peer assessment is a learning process, is a learning activity. So peer assessment as learning. By looking at someone else's work, you reflect about your own work and you develop higher order thinking and cognition skills. Sorry. How would I approach this? What kind of assessment, what kind of score should I give? Those are quite interesting and important skills for teachers to develop, and I think also really important, it gives us an opportunity to establish a connection, to establish a form of professional exchange between teachers. And in most of our, or in many of our courses, and I think also, for example, in eTwinning, the work that Ruta is doing, the ideas of connectivism, connectivist learning theory are quite prevalent. At the focus being that we're trying to connect teachers, trying to connect professionals to exchange with each other in some kind of community. So, and this is part of that. That's part of the rationale. And the other aspect is, well, peer assessment for learning. The feedback that you're getting from your peers, well, it's not just about getting the score. It's about getting the certificate as a consequence of that. It's about actually getting interesting ideas how you develop your work. So that's a core part as well. So that brings me back to the point, well, even if we don't find an interesting sort of link there between peer and expert assessment, there is a value in this even regardless of that. Nevertheless, of course, if we want for these benefits to occur, then we need teachers to enter these activities with a positive approach to them and a trusting approach to them. So the sub-questions that we're addressing are, what are the similarities and differences between expert and peer assessment, and how are both types of assessment valued by teachers and student teachers? And we are not really yet in a stage to report on that second question. As I've said, this is still work in progress and sort of tentative results. So what did we do? Well, we randomly sampled 106 lesson plans from one of our TeachUP courses. As part of the courses, the peer assessment was done, of course, so we had all the results from that. And then we sent those in each country to also an external expert. And then we had a look at the comparison there. What does that show us? Well, the peer average score was 3.6 out of 4, while the external expert average score was 3.2. So, and this is a statistically significant difference, so we can say that peers on average give higher scores than experts. The difference, however, is not especially large. I mean, it's a 0.4 difference in a scale from 1 to 4, so it's not a huge difference. And especially if you look at the difference between the scores for the work of the teachers, where the peers gave 3.7 and the experts gave 3.5. It's only 0.2. There's a more pronounced difference between students of 0.6. Now, what's interesting to see here on this slide is that we also see a correlation between sort of low, if the experts gave a lower grade, the peers also gave a slightly lower grade. There's less variability in the peers' grades, which are the blue dots. It's all quite high, but you can nevertheless see that there is a sort of a link between the levels given by the experts and the levels given by the levels given by the experts and how that relates to the levels given by the peers. So it's quite high, but it's not entirely off there in regards to the spread of it. These are the different, or these are abbreviations of the different criteria where the scores were given. We can see that the peers are giving there's a significant consistency between these different criteria. So they are giving the same score for each of the criteria. Not sure what that tells us, but we can see that the experts are slightly different. There's a bigger divergence there. So for example, for the assessment criteria, the scores gave substantially lower scores compared to the other criteria. Which is sort of what you would probably expect. So the peers might not be as nuanced there in regards to their assessment of these different areas. It could also tell us something about maybe how we designed the peer assessment. Maybe the rubric that we provided wasn't entirely clear. Maybe you required a certain level of expertise to actually use it in regards to the assessment criteria. So there's many different possible explanations for this. So let's look at the peers, just the peers, and the peers' variability. So I've said already that the average score was 3.6, but there are two components of that. The first component is that what is the variability of scores between the lesson plans? So in an ideal world, this would be 100%. So every lesson plan is slightly different from another, so it gets a slightly different score. Now, we don't see that ideal world, but that's not a realistic scenario, but we do see that the peers do give, there is a variability of 70% between the lesson plans. So some are getting a lower score, some are getting a higher score. The second aspect which comes into that average score is the difference between the scores given to one lesson plan. So each lesson plan was evaluated 3 times, and we can see there's a variability of 30% in the scores that the peers have given to the lesson plan. So in an ideal world, this would be 0. So everybody would give the same score. Now, again, that's not realistic, and we know that's also not the case when we look at instructor assessment. Nevertheless, it's not negligible. It's a 30% variance. Another part of the investigation is that we looked at the qualitative comments that were made. And we looked at it from the length of the feedback, the tone of the feedback, and the constructiveness of the feedback. And we can see, for example, that the expert feedback was more detailed, was longer. And in a way, it's not surprising. The experts were paid for a task to do. The peers, they did this as part of a course. They weren't paid. They had quite a lot of other workload as part of the course. So it's not that surprising. The tone of the feedback, it's fairly close to each other, but the experts were slightly more critical there. And in regards to the constructive nature of the feedback, it's also fairly close together, but the expert feedback was more constructive overall. So we can make some first conclusions, quite tentative, but we are not yet fully ready to present an overall interpretation of this. What we can say is, as a summary, peers on average give significantly higher scores than experts. Differences are, however, fairly small. For the feedback part in the written, experts give slightly longer and more constructive feedback. What we can say regarding their perceptions of the peer assessment, we're not quite ready yet, as I've mentioned, but what we can already mention is that the quality of the course was highly valued. So if the peers would have, if the participants would have seen the peer assessment as very problematic, given that it was a core part of the course, we would have expected also the quality scoring that the participants gave to the score to be quite low. We didn't see that. The quality was rated very highly, so we're expecting also that the assessments, the peer assessment, doesn't necessarily score very, very low. And first indications suggest that actually self-assessment, peer assessment, and expert assessment are equally valued. But that's work in progress. Okay, that's maybe some other points regarding questions that we're still addressing here, and hopefully which will come up in the discussion as well. So where does the difference between the assessments stem from? Is there a difference between two assessments systematically the same? What conclusions can we draw regarding the validity of peer assessments? And what conclusions can we draw regarding the design of peer assessment activities? So hopefully from the outcomes of this, we will be able to learn something on how to prove the peer assessments on the European Schoolnet Academy and in other teacher training MOOCs and environments. Thank you very much. That's it from my side. I hope that's given you